Good afternoon and good morning, wherever you may be. Welcome to our Fleet Safety webinar series. Today, we are focusing on driver qualifications. My name is Laura Umdell, and I'm the Director of Operations at Yahara Software. Yahara has been in business for over 20 years, providing comprehensive software solutions within the transportation space. Yahara Software is honored to sponsor today's webinar with our subject matter expert, Clay Merchis. A few quick housekeeping notes. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A feature at any time. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Yahara Software website under the news section. We will send out a link for this also. Today's webinar is also part of a series, and the next session will be regarding motor carrier driver record requirements on July 26. Lastly, we will include contact information on the final slide. I would like to welcome Clay Merchis from Leading Edge Consulting. Clay has over 25 years of experience improving all sectors of fleet's organization, including safety, human resources, operations, and maintenance. He has experience working with fleet sizes ranging from 20 to over 4,000 trucks. Clay received his Bachelor of Science degree from Harding University with an emphasis in business law. He continued his education at Harding and received his MBA with an emphasis in leadership and management. Later, he earned his CDS through the North American Transportation Management Institute. He has received multiple National Fleet Safety Awards, including third place at the TCA National Fleet Safety Contest and in two separate years. Clay is a frequent speaker at industry events regarding federal motor carrier safety regulations, improving fleet safety programs, and industry best practices. Without any more delay, let's dive into our topic for today, and I will now pass the baton over to Clay.
Thank you, Laura. I appreciate the kind words and the introduction. So second webinar now in our series, and we're going to dive into some really good DOT regulations regarding driver qualifications. One of the things I do want to set up differently on this webinar compared to the first webinar is we're actually going to have a live interaction capabilities on this webinar. So if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to make during the presentation, please raise your hand icon. I will see that notification pop up, and then we'll be able to unmute your speaker, and you could either ask the question or make a comment regarding a particular regulation that we might be covering. So without further ado, let's get into our presentation and our slideshow here. So the first thing I want to talk about, of course, is just going to be driver regulations and this big, huge federal motor carrier safety handbook that we have. So about 700 pages of this handbook. Those of you who are newer to the industry may look at the regulations remotely and log into FMCSA. Those of you who are a little bit more old school may purchase copies of these. These are typically updated twice a year. And someone like J.J. Keller or other vendors will publish these. The published materials can be purchased two different ways. One is like this handbook right here that actually has comments and interpretations printed in the regulation and the guidebook. And the other way is to be able to do that remotely. And again, you can access the interpretations remote as well. All right, so right before we get into our presentation here, I do have a quick poll question that we're going to pop up on your screen here. And that poll question is going to have to do with what regulations manage and monitor driver qualifications. So what federal motor carrier safety regulations outline driver qualifications? make your selection. Is it section 382, 390, 391, or 395? All right, and it looks like 391 is the answer, and you are correct. 391 of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations have to do with the driver qualifications. So we're going to dive into those sections of 391 that really are important for us to focus on. All right, so when we look at section 391, driver qualifications and disqualifications of drivers, we're going to first of all focus on qualifications. And what makes a driver qualified to be able to operate a CMV? And in section 391.11, it specifically says a driver cannot drive a CMV unless he or she is qualified. And then in section B right here, it says a person is qualified if he or she meets certain criteria. So the criteria that a driver must meet are 7 criteria, and that's underlined in 391.11B. I want to talk about these specifically and talk about some caveats that we need to think about. So obviously the first one being at least 21 years of age. Remember that many intrastate rules and state rules will allow drivers to operate a motor vehicle at the age of 18. Interstate commerce requires 21 years of age. Of course, FMCSA has been toying around with several different programs about and allowing younger drivers to be able to operate in interstate commerce. They are exploring reducing the age to 18 from a federal motor carrier perspective, but currently interstate commerce is 21 years of age. Number 2, must be able to read and speak the English language sufficiently to converse with the general public, understand highway traffic signs, so forth and so on. Again, from a state perspective and intrastate rules, there are some states that allow Spanish-speaking drivers for intrastate commerce. If you are hiring a driver for interstate commerce, and it's important to look at the state of their CDL and make sure that they were not intrastate driver experienced prior to applying for your interstate commerce driving position. If so, you may need to scrutinize number 2 just a little bit more and make sure that they meet all of the requirements of interstate commerce and can sufficiently speak the English language, converse with the general public, and understand road signs. All right, number 3, can by reason, experience, training, or both safely operate the type of commercial motor vehicle he or she drives. You know, this is a little bit more important for people who have different types of equipment rather than just a general box trailer and tractor combination. So I like to call this out for those types of businesses and motor carriers that might have specialized equipment. Something like maybe a dump truck, or obviously someone who's pulling tankers. Or long combination vehicles specifically too. Those types of motor vehicles must have additional thought and scrutiny during orientation and prior to putting them back behind the wheel. So you will want to make sure that they can control the operation of that vehicle if it's going to be, let's say, for example, the tanker vehicle. And that they are used to being able to operate and pull that vehicle that's going to have baffles or unbaffled equipment. Number 4 is the physical qualification of that driver. Obviously, the driver has to be able to pass physical qualifications in order to operate a CMV. So he must have his physical card and present that physical card to you prior to allowing them to operate that CMV. One caveat that we want to make sure that we do from a motor carrier perspective as well is validate that doctor that issued that medical card is on the national registry. But from a driver perspective, as long as he has his physical card and he presents that physical card to you, he is a qualified driver. Number 5, that driver must have a current CDL and issued by one state only. So obviously every state is pretty good at invalidating and connecting to the SID list to be able to update CDLs and when one driver transfers from one state to another state. But we must make sure that we do have a current copy of that CDL on file. So that driver must make sure that he presents that CDL to you at time of hire and orientation. The driver is a qualified driver as long as he's not disqualified to operate a CMV. And we'll get into some of those driver qualifications and disqualifications here on the future slides. But as long as he's not disqualified, obviously, then he's a qualified driver. And then the number 7, the last requirement for qualifications of drivers is that they must complete a road test or be issued a certificate of road test from a prior employer, or he could present a copy of that CDL to you. All right, questions for me. If you have a question, remember, raise your hand and we could address that question and unmute you. If you have a comment, same circumstance, raise your hand and we could discuss this in more detail. Questions or comments on this slide? Awesome. All right, let's get into driver qualifications in section 391.13. So 391.11, we listed the 7 items that a driver must be able to do to be qualified. 391.13 states that a driver cannot operate a motor vehicle unless if he has experience, training, or both to be able to determine that he can properly locate, distribute, and secure cargo in that commercial motor vehicle. So a lot of times during our orientation process, we'll go out and we'll do a road test with drivers. We'll do the pre-trip inspection requirements, and we'll also address being able to slide tandems and weight distribution and loading distribution requirements that you might have for your specific piece of equipment and clients and customers that you deal with. I remember back in the day when I was a flatbedder, we went on out and we had simulated loads on our yard. And we would do what we call securement training and extended training on your yard. And that's where we set up damaged coils or rejected product in the past. And we had those set up on our trailers out in our yard. We were able to go out to the yard with the drivers and specifically review setup, how to put our dunnage, where we want to locate those product and that product on our trailer. And then of course, how to be able to secure down those requirements, not only from a federal motor carrier safety regulatory perspective, but from a company policy perspective. So load securements that we required or additional securements that we required above and beyond the regulations. For van type operators and those who are pulling trailers and enclosed trailers, you want to make sure that you have some kind of discussion with your drivers, regarding shipper load count loads, seal and tack, drop and hooks, those types of products and customer requirements that you might have, where to scale out loads, and where to locate, certain certified scales such as CAT scales throughout the country. You'll also want to be able to discuss how to slide your tandems if you have a typical 53-foot trailer without a spread axle and a combination axle. Any questions for me on 391.13 and what the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations require regarding load securements and securing processes in or on trailers? Again, raise your hand if you do have a question. Raise your hand if you have a comment. Perfect. All right, let's get into and discuss disqualifications. So under 391.15, it specifically says a driver who is disqualified shall not drive a CMV. And then it gets into several subsections there on what disqualifies drivers. So again, we'll want to be very familiar with our Federal Motor Carrier Safety Handbook and, you know, put tabs on there for certain sections. In the olden days, that's what I did. I typically use the online version now, but, you know, even in the olden days, I would highlight certain sections of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Handbook with my tabs associated with it. So then I could just flip to that if I had to reference something. Again, these days it might be a little bit easier just to pull it up on a Google search and say, you know, 49 CFR 391, and then it'll pull up your regulations and your interpretations right there. When we look at driver disqualifications and we look at letter B, it says disqualifications for the loss of the driving privilege. The loss of the driving privilege is essentially what the state will do to the CMV, or I'm sorry, to the CDL. So essentially, if you know they disqualify, suspend, or revoke a CDL, that's what that is referencing. So if the state pulls your CDL or the driver's CDL, that obviously disqualifies the driver to be able to operate. Letter C, disqualification for certain criminal offenses. That could be a criminal offense such as a hit and run, or some other type of criminal offense, drug and alcohol type violation that would disqualify that CDL. Then next one is going to be a disqualification for out of service violation orders. So if a driver is placed out of service on roadside and he jumps that out of service order, and it's either a jumping the out of service order from a driver perspective or from the equipment perspective, and he is convicted of jumping an out of service order, that would disqualify his CDL. And then the last disqualification in here that's listed is going to be for the prohibition of texting or using handheld devices. They specifically call out those violations in the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. And if you get multiple violations within a certain period of time, then they will prohibit the driver from being able to operate the CMV, and they will have that restriction, whether it's a 60-day license suspension or more, depending on how many violations he's had of texting or using a handheld device. Remember, these regulations that we're going over talk about a driver who is disqualified and cannot operate a CMV in these circumstances. Questions for me over this slide or comments? All right. Under 391.32, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulation states that a driver cannot drive until he has completed and furnished motor carrier that employs him with an application of employment. And then they talk about in here, that meets the requirements of paragraph B, and there's 12 items listed in paragraph B. Most carriers utilize some kind of third-party system and don't really have paper applications anymore. We're all electronic, it seems like these days. So typically speaking, if you use a third-party vendor with your application process, it is standardized and you're able to meet those 12 criteria that's outlined in section B. If you are using paper applications, really look at those 12 items in section B and make sure that your paper application has all of those 12 items listed. If you utilize a third-party vendor and you have customized your application process, go back in the regulations in 391.32B and look at those 12 items and make sure that all 12 of those items are on your electronic application that you customized and that you did not remove any one of those 12 listed items. So examples, or a couple examples of those 12 listed items, are going to be that final notation at the end that says, I certify that all the information that I filled out on this application is complete and accurate to the best of my knowledge. And then they sign. That statement must be there on the application. The signature block must be there on the application. Again, there's 12 items. Make sure that those 12 items are all on that application, regardless if it's a paper application or an electronic application. Questions on this particular slide discussing the application of employment? All right, 391.31 and 391.33 discuss road tests. Prior to COVID, it seems like a good portion of the industry did complete road tests. When COVID occurred, obviously a lot of people ended up changing and modifying their processes to ensure that they had social distancing and spacing inside the vehicle. So a lot of people went away from the road test and physical road test and just took the CDL and a copy of that CDL in lieu of the road test. The regulations allow for both or either. So you can get a copy of the CDL and still conduct a road test with a driver. Remember, if you do have specific long combination vehicles or specialized equipment, that you are required to conduct road tests no matter what on those special types of equipment. However, general purposes and general terms, if it was just a regular box tractor and trailer, then you could just accept that CDL. You still can accept that CDL. And the equivalent to the road test down below, where we talk about in place of the road test, and as the equivalent to, it says, the CDL is number one, or the applicant can provide a copy of a previous road test certificate that he had within the past 3 years. That could also be used in lieu of conducting a road test. If we do conduct a road test, and we want that road test, and our intention of the road test is to be compliant with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, then we want to make sure that we look at those requirements for the road test under 391.31. They specifically outline specific things that should be addressed in a Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulation road test. Again, if you've customized your road test and your paperwork for that road test, ensure that every piece of requirements, such as a pre-trip inspection, such as coupling and uncoupling and backing, being able to operate a motor vehicle and control the gauges and slow the motor vehicle. All of those checklists that are outlined in 391.31 are on your road test that you're completing. If you're missing something from that road test, that's fine, because as long as you get the copy of the CDL, you're still compliant with the regulations. It's just not going to be a federal motor carrier safety regulated road test. It would just be a company policy that you have and a road test that you do according to company policy. So again, if you're intending to meet the requirements of the road test, look at 391.31 and ensure that those items listed on there are on your road test. And then the final thing that you want to make sure is, even though you have that road test and you might have that checklist, if you do not issue the certificate after completion of that road test, then it would not be a federal motor carrier safety regulatory road test. Questions or comments on road tests? Raise your hand again if you do have a question or comment, and then we can unmute your speaker to allow you to ask that question or make that comment. Okay, great. Again, we talked about earlier in those 7 items that a driver must be physically qualified in order to operate that CMV. A call out under 391.41 is that driver must also have a copy of that physical card, or a copy or the actual card on his person. So while he is driving, we want to make sure that the driver has a copy of their CDL and they have a copy of their physical card with them on their person. So if they do get a DOT inspection, they will be able to provide both of those. Back in the olden days, I remember it was kind of a pain. I would receive a call maybe at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night from night dispatch. Of course, they did not have access to our paper DQ files, so I'd have to go into the office, or someone would from safety would have to go into the office and fax a copy back in the olden days of that physical card. Now it's a whole lot easier. Obviously, we could send those electronically to the driver to a cell phone. But remember, just because we have those electronically does not negate that the driver does not have to carry a copy of that card with them anymore. So, questions for me on this slide? Perfect. All right, I think we'll have another poll question here. And our second poll question and last poll question for the presentation is going to be, what federal motor carrier safety regulation provides 4 tables that prescribe CDL disqualification periods if a CLP or CDL holder is convicted of specific regulations? Make your choice and selection. Is it going to be 383? Is it going to be 390? 392 or 396? All right. For those of you who said 383, you are correct. So table 3, there are 4 tables actually in 383. So 383.51 is what we want to think about for disqualifying offenses for that CDL. When we look at those 4 tables, and we will get into those here on the next slides. The first table talks about major offenses. Second table talks about serious traffic violations. Third one has to do with railroad crossing violations or offenses. And then that last table has to do with jumping out of service orders. Additionally, if a driver is determined to be an imminent hazard, then he is also disqualified to be able to operate as CMV. So let's get into these disqualifying offenses. Table 1 of 383. So talks about these controlled substances and disqualifying events for operating a CMV and having convictions for controlled substances, and then also just trafficking persons, and then committing a crime with a CMV. The thing I want to think about is events that occur on table 1 is tied to a CDL or CLP holder that commits that offense in any motor vehicle. It is not tied to a CDL. Let me back up. It's not tied to a CMV. I'm sorry, I misstated that. It's not tied to a CMV. If you are a CDL holder and you commit these offenses and are convicted of these offenses, it is tied to your CDL, regardless of the type of vehicle you operate. All right, so when we look at the table right here and we look at this, the first section of this table right here talks about the type of conviction that you have while operating a CMV. The second list or second section of this table talks about the conviction while not operating a CMV, or in other words, your personal vehicle. If you are convicted, then it will suspend your license for 1 year. And that's the state will suspend your license for 1 year after the conviction. Now, people will ask me and they'll give me a call and say, hey, Clay, we have a new applicant in orientation. And when we're looking at the MVR, it doesn't make much sense to me because I see that he had a, let's say a DWI, 6 months ago, and his license was not suspended. Why is that? Why is there no suspension for the year? And the first thing that I'll do is I'll go on back and I'll ask that motor carrier, when did he get his CDL? Is he a recent CDL graduate? So if he's a recent CDL graduate, and let's say he's only had a CDL a couple months, and now he's applied to your organization, did that offense occur within the last 12 months and prior to him either holding a CDL or a learner's permit? If that's the case, that would be the reason why he did not have that license suspension, because he was not a CDL holder or CLP learner permit holder at the time of the offense. Big distinction. Questions or comments regarding this slide from the group? Again, if you have a question or a comment, so it's an interactive discussion, so raise your hand and we'll make sure that we unmute you and ask your question or make your comment. Perfect. All right, let's get into table 2. Table 2 of the of 383.51 talks again about any major offenses or serious offenses, I should say, of while driving a vehicle. And remember, the first section of this table right here says if the driver operates a motor vehicle and is convicted of these crimes, then, or these offenses, I should say, then the CDL holder will have the certain disqualification periods. So, second conviction of one of these offenses in a CMV will result in the 60-day license suspension. Again, if they're getting a second conviction in a non-CMV, in this particular case, they have the exact same disqualification period, 60-day disqualification period. When we think of this, remember this time period is for a 3-year time period on this table right here. So we want to think about our company policies, our minimum hiring guidelines, and when drivers are onboarded and in full-time employment at our organization. We must think about and consider this table when we set up our policies and procedures and minimum hiring guidelines, and ensure that our applicants meet the minimum hiring guidelines, and those minimum hiring guidelines mirror at least this. They can be more strict, but they must mirror the minimum standards. And then the same thing after they become onboarded with you, that we look at that 3-year look back period and make sure that our guidelines and policies mirror the minimum requirements on federal motor carrier safety regulation. All right, let's get into table 3. Table 3 talks about specifically violations that occur in a CMV. So while driving a CMV, for the first conviction of table 3 violations, then we will have a CDL suspension for 60 days. Second conviction will be a CDL suspension for 120 days. For the first conviction and second conviction, when we look at the table right here, it should be separate incidences, again, within a 3-year period. So we have a 3-year look back. These violations, again, are specific to operating a CMV, and table 3 specifically talks about railroad crossing violations. All right, our next table is table 4. Table 4, again, when we look at table 4, we're looking at if the driver operates a CMV and is convicted of. So again, it's in a commercial motor vehicle. First conviction, second conviction. And remember to look at the top and what time period we're looking for if these violations occur. And these specifically, remember, are going to be out of service violation orders. So if a driver is convicted of jumping an out of service violation order, then they will have suspensions and disqualifications on their CDLs for these time periods. All right, I mentioned earlier our intimate hazard. When we think of an intimate hazard, people ask me, Clay, what does that mean? And what's that definition? The definition of the intimate hazard is in 383.5. And that's at the top section of that subpart of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulation. And it specifically talks about that imminent hazard. All right, those were the disqualifications in the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. Questions for me on those disqualifications? If you have a question, raise your hand. If you have a comment, we'll talk about that last section. All right, as we're getting close to wrapping up here, I want to talk about just some other relevant prohibitions. They're not disqualifications. They don't impact and affect the CDL specifically. However, there are specific prohibitions in the regulations that I do want to call out The first one is going to be in section 392.3, and that's talking about the ill or fatigued driver. It says no driver shall operate the commercial motor vehicle if he's become ill or fatigued to the point that makes it unsafe for him to be able to operate that commercial motor vehicle. One of the things that I did at my motor carrier was, obviously I talked to drivers about this in orientation, and we would also talk to drivers about this if they called in, and our dispatchers, if they called into the dispatch office and said, hey, you know, Clay, I'm not feeling so good today. I don't know. I'm not sure, you know, if I feel good enough to be able to operate. We specifically called this regulation out and said, hey, are you so ill? Do you not feel good enough that you won't be able to operate that CMV safely? And if that's up to that driver to be able to tell us that. If he told us that, then we would say, okay, yep, we're gonna, you know, don't operate the CMV. Obviously, we're either getting touch with the customer to reschedule the load, or we'll set up a relay or whatever it might be, and we'd just go through our internal processes and procedures to be able to rebook or reschedule the load. One of the other call outs and driver prohibitions, of course, has to do with drugs and alcohol. There are many states now that have passed you know, marijuana use and the ability to smoke marijuana. Remember, if you're a CDL holder, that does not affect the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations at all. No driver can be on duty or be under the influence of any controlled substance. That includes marijuana use. So regardless of what that CDL holder state is out of, and what that state has from a personal requirement or allowance of marijuana, drivers cannot use, CDL drivers cannot use marijuana and operate a CMV. Alcohol prohibitions are the same way. Couple call outs on this one are to think about that a driver cannot have any alcohol in the bunk of his truck. So only alcohol could be transported as part of a load, must be part of laden. So one of the things I think about is if a driver is, let's say he's an over-the-road driver, and he stops, you know, for, let's say, the Super Bowl or something like that, and he's out on the road and he wants to be able to watch this game inside the bunk and relax and maybe have a beer or something like that. He cannot do that in the CMV. So you cannot have any alcohol inside the cab. And the other thing I think about, so here's the unless if it's manifested in the transport of the shipment. And the other one I think about is he cannot be under the influence of alcohol or have any concentration detected in his body, as long as he has physical control of that CMV. And this physical control of the CMV is what I get into detail with drivers, and we talk about in orientation or training with drivers, is if you have some kind of alcohol, and let's say you parked at an Applebee's or something like that and went in to the Applebee's and had something to drink. If you come back out to your truck to take that 10-hour break, and a DOT officer comes on over and tells you that you got to move your vehicle, you can't park there anymore, whatever it might be, and you have alcohol on your breath, and that driver has alcohol on his breath, he is in physical control of that vehicle because he's in the bunk. His keys obviously are going to be with him inside the cab. And I've had drivers in the past, unfortunately, get a drug and alcohol violation for that circumstance and instance. The other thing I do want to call out on the bottom of this slide, obviously, we're talking about 392 in this slide and the prior one, but remember 382 talks about all drug and alcohol requirements and violations prohibition. So reference 382 as well. All right, next prohibition I want to go over has to do with 395, and that's hours of service regulations. Really, driver cannot operate a vehicle if he has driven more than 11 hours in the 14-hour period, cannot drive more than the 14-hour rule, and must take those 30-minute breaks and think about that 60-70-hour rule. And again, remember this specifically right here is going to be for property interstate driving. If you transport people, well, have those additional rules. They're a little bit tighter on the federal motor carrier safety regulations. All right, couple things I'd like to call out on as far as best practices go. There are several regulations in there. We've covered some of them today with 391, 392, 390, 383. Several of those regulations state that drivers must be knowledgeable in and comply with. So how do we know if a driver is knowledgeable in? I issued this federal motor carrier written examination and orientation. And depending on the circumstance and the carrier I was at, sometimes we did it electronically prior to the driver coming in the orientation and getting issued his truck. And he would complete a written test with multiple choice questions and fill it out and complete it. And then I had that firsthand knowledge that the driver understood the regulations that he was required to be knowledgeable in. It's outlined in our book. I encourage all of the motor carriers that I work with to continue this and use a written examination and orientation. So if there is a question about a driver understanding the regulations from anyone or an outside party, we could pull out this written examination with the driver's information on it and say, yes, he is knowledgeable in section 390. He's knowledgeable in section 391. You can see here's his test that he took an orientation and passed. The next thing I like to do as well as a best practice is make sure that our company policies outline certain regulations. And we don't have to call out all of them, right? It's 700 pages of this manual. Most of the regulations, drivers could look at themselves. A lot of our motor carriers, we issue the mini book, which is this green book, but in mini form to the driver so they could have access to that in their truck at all times. Nowadays, again, with the application to be able to pull up the federal motor carrier safety regulations on their phones, drivers could access it on their phones as well. But I do like to call out certain regulations. This is some sample policy that we've issued to one of our clients in the past. And one of the things I like to do is call out the federal motor carrier safety regulation that is applicable to the driver, and then how we as a company manage that federal motor carrier safety regulation if it were to come up. All right, we're nearing the end of our hour, and I'd like to open it up for any questions or comments from the attendees. If you have any questions or comments, like Laura mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, please type those questions or comments in the chat, and we'll be able to read those. Give it just a minute here for any questions. If no questions come in, then we'll be able to give you 7 or 8 minutes back in your day. So it'd be nice. All right. It doesn't look like any questions have come in, so I do want to thank everyone for their time today. Again, remember on about being compliant with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations is pretty important. And the Yahara team has developed a software package called Fleet Fidelity, and it takes all of our information and important KPIs from all those third-party systems that you use. So your TMS, your ELD, and your camera providers. And it takes all of that data that's important to you and rolls it up in the one dashboard and screen. This is really cool technology. It's leading edge out here, and I love the application, and just wanted to share it with the group. If you do have any comments, questions, or thoughts about the Fleet Fidelity program, please reach out to the Yahara team, and they will contact you regarding Fleet Fidelity. Otherwise, my contact info is below and on this slide. If you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out direct. And I look forward to our next seminar in our series next month on carrier requirements and federal motor carrier safety regulations that impact the motor carrier.
Thank you, Clay, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. To all the attendees, we appreciate you taking the time to attend the webinar, and we hope you can join us in our next session on July 26th, as Clay mentioned. We will be sending out an email with links to today's presentation and contact information for Leading Edge Consulting and Yahara software. We'll also send out a brief survey, or you can find the survey in the chat right now. Please fill it out so we can continue to improve the content and materials we provide in the future. As an added incentive, we're going to be doing a drawing of a random name for all the responses we get, and we'll send out a $25 Amazon gift card to the lucky recipient. Thank you for attending. I hope you have a great rest of your day.